Glad I got that on film. What's up, guys? Welcome back to the shop. So in this episode, we're gonna do something I didn't really plan on doing, and that is just getting a motor put back in the Shevelle so I can have the Shevelle up and running this year. So long story short, we spun a rod bearing last fall. I got a 6-liter, everything checked out at the machine shop. The 6-liter is good to go. However, we've got boxes and boxes and boxes of rotating assembly and engine parts in the garage, but certain parts are on back order. So that being said, I probably won't be able to have a motor in this until maybe September, October. By the time the parts come in, the machine shop gets done, I get the motor reassembled and get it put back in the car. And that just simply won't do. I can't go a whole summer without having the Shevelle or something that we can haul all the kids around into shows and things like that. So walk with me over here to the paint booth. I'm gonna turn the fan off, it's super loud in there. So I happened to come across another 6-liter a couple weeks ago, and it was too good of a deal to pass up. It was 500 bucks. Supposedly a good running 6-liter, had 180,000 miles on it. The guy was driving down the interstate or doing something, and it just started free revving. So he thought he broke the crank, so he ordered a new 6-liter. Turns out it was the flex plate that broke. You probably can't see that down there, but the flex plate little ring is still attached to the back of the crank. So he ordered a motor, not needing a motor, just needing a flex plate. And so, hey, he said, I'm gonna sell the motor. How's 500 bucks on? I said, sounds pretty good, I'll take it. So that being said, we're gonna pull this motor apart somewhat. We'll pull the heads off, we'll pull the pistons out. We're gonna gap the rings for the boost. I'll probably put my LS1 heads on here since they're set up and ready to go. I'm debating on if I'm gonna throw the BTR Stage 3 positive displacement cam in or not. But definitely, I think I'll put the blower on it for sure. This guy's a little bit of a shade tree mechanic. That's the top half of the transmission. There was 2 bolts still in it. When we picked it up, I said, oh, is that transmission bell housing still attached to the back of the block? And he goes, no, I don't think so. We walked over and looked at his transmission. It was definitely broke across the top. So I'm not sure if he was prying on it, beating it, or what the deal was, but the motor's out. We're gonna tear into it and see if it looks good, if it's worth the shit. This could just be a pipe dream until we get the bottom end opened up. So let's get that done. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Check out our website, ftpspeedshop.com, and hit up our Amazon links in the description. You know, it really helps us out, helps support the channel, helps fund the channel, helps us get more equipment and cameras and microphones and audio stuff. So let's get this thing tore apart and see what it is. Yeah. And I think what I'm gonna do to start this off, I kind of pulled some of the stuff off the top, and I think I'm gonna go ahead and spray this thing down with some degreaser and some brake clean and things like that, and just get in here with the wire brush and clean this block up. Since it's still pretty sealed up for the most part, I can get this thing cleaned up halfway decent, and then I don't have to worry about all this stuff getting in the motor when I have the heads off and things like that. Here we got the block pretty well cleaned up. I think I got all the grease off of it. I gave her a degreaser and brake clean bath. She's drying out now. Popped off this valve cover. Pretty darn black. Popped off this valve cover. Oh, it looks pretty damn clean. I don't know, that's kind of interesting. Never really seen inside the valve cover be that much of a different color. So has maybe this head been off at some point and cleaned up, or what? I don't know. Is there something that I'm missing here? Why is one side dirtier than the other? I mean, could it be bad PCV valve or something? I have no idea. But that's kind of wild. This side is blacker than night, and this side really doesn't look too bad. It looks pretty damn clean. If I popped off both of them and they look like that, I would be freaking stoked. Okay, so it's been a couple nights here. I have got the engine all cleaned up and painted. We used a combination of the Rust-Oleum high temp engine paint with some Duplicolor engine clear coat, and this thing is shiny as a mofo. A lot shinier than I anticipated it to be, but hey, who cares? That's gonna work just fine. We also pulled the pistons out of it, and good news, all the rods look pretty good. There's a little bit of scoring in a couple of them, which is probably to be expected. They are pretty damn dirty actually, and a little, you know, sticky in spots, you know. So I have one of them dipped in this Chem bucket. This is a Chem Dip, just to see what that does, and it actually is cleaning it up pretty good if you look at it compared to, you know, look at that, just sitting in there for about an hour compared to that piston. And yeah, okay, so it's actually cleaning it quite nicely. Take these rings off. We want to push the ring around as much as possible, and then okay, you can see that dot right there. So that dot does go up, and then just take the top end up and then just slowly work it around. You want to be really careful with these things because they are fairly brittle and they can snap and break, but just kind of just slowly work those up and over and pop it out. And we started popping off some rings because we are going to have to open up the ring end gap on these, because this bad boy is going to have some boost to it. So the way we do that, we take the rings off very carefully. This is the number 1 cylinder. I have the first and second ring off of. I have the first ring in the cylinder that it's going to go in. We want to make sure that all this stuff matches with each cylinder that it came out of and each cylinder that's going to go back into. So, you know, you throw the ring in the cylinder, and then in order to get it square, go ahead and take the piston with the top 2 rings off, and we're just going to use that to square that piston ring up in the bore. Now I was shooting for 24 thou on the top and 28 on the bottom, and the top ring checks out at 28 thou. So we're not going to have to worry about gapping this one. We don't need to take any material off. It's definitely bigger than what we wanted. So we're going to go ahead and pop this ring out and put the second ring in and check that for gap. Now we're going to want to put this one to what I'm shooting for is about 28 thou on this one. And this is a little more difficult with one hand than it is with 2 hands. So I like to just kind of get it set in there and make sure it's all the way in and close to the top. We'll go ahead and take our piston and we'll just push the piston down. Make sure it's all the way seated on that oil ring. And now we know that that piston ring is square in the bore. Take our handy dandy feeler gauge. We're going to check that gap. This is 28, which is what I had for the top ring. And I would say that the bottom ring is probably 28, 29 thou. So these 2 rings are going to be perfect. We're not going to have to file on them. So we're going to go ahead and put those back on the piston. We're going to go to the number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, number 6, number 7 cylinders. We're going to do this all the way through, and we're going to make sure that we have proper end ring gaps. So when we put the boost to it and we get the high cylinder pressures, we're not butting a ring end together and blowing a piston apart, because that sounds like poop. So Alright guys, so I've been working away on the 6 liter here. I got all the pistons pulled out and dipped them in the Chem Dip. cleaned them all off, put them in the parts cleaner, and then brake cleaned them all off, and they're looking really good, and they're ready to go in. I did remove the bearings from the rods, but I did keep everything in order, so they all should go back in the right spot, and everything should just be the exact same it was when it came apart. Now let's go over to the other bench and take a look at the pistons and rods, because these things came out super clean. I was super impressed with how well these things cleaned up. This Chem Dip, I just said Dick, this Chem Dip took a little bit of time to use and get it all clean, but man, it did awesome. It got all the carbon off, it got all the gunk off, it got just, I mean, this is a dirty motor, so it got a lot of that off, and they look within reason brand new. So let's go take a look at them. So like I said, we pulled all the pistons out. I gapped the rings, and by gap the rings, I mean the rings were already gapped big enough. They were all between 28 to 30 thou. I did pop off all the rod bearings when I started cleaning it, and look at how these things turned out. I mean, they are just really damn clean. So clean that they even have a little bit of squeaking issue in between there. So we're gonna go ahead and oil all the wrist pins. We put a little oil down here in the rod. We're gonna get the bearings put back in these things, and then we'll coat the skirts with oil, and we'll get them dropped back in. We'll probably maybe even just dip the whole head of the piston in oil so that the rings all have a nice oil bath in them, so that we don't have to worry about anything sticking. And we'll get these things torqued down. So I just got a regular bucket, painting bucket with some 10W30 in it. And I got all these labeled here. I just put a little stamp on the cap. That's number 5. And then when I labeled all these, I put rod end and cap end. So I know exactly which one these go into and how they go in. So I'm going to go ahead, and these things have all been blown off with brake clean and wiped down, and they are, there's nothing left on them. That's why they're a little squeaky. There ain't a drop of oil left on these things because they've been soaking and cleaning. I'll just take a little bit of oil in here and just coat the bearing area just to keep any rust or anything from getting in there. And this is obviously the cap end. The little tang on the bearing goes down into the tang on the cap. Just push it in place. And then we'll go ahead and clean any of that old oil off of the bearing surface itself. And then when we go ahead and assemble this, we'll go ahead and put some assembly lube on there, because it might be a couple weeks before this gets started, and we just want to make sure that everything is nice and juicy. So we already got that loaded down. Again, with the rod end, the tang goes into the tang. It probably isn't a bad idea just to double check and make sure there's no trash on the back side of the bearing, since I have been sitting on the bench for a few days. Make sure they get in there good and nice and flush. I don't know if it's cool or not, but these are called, they're snapped rods. So they're actually cast as one piece, and then they snap them. And they really can only go on one way. If you look at that crazy lip right there, both ends have the lip, but it does not mate. So it's almost like a extra layer of idiot proof right there. So, and then once we get the caps on, and once they get ready to go in, I'm just going to go ahead and set the piston in here. And I don't want to, it's not filling the piston up with oil, but it's getting that wrist pin nice and oily. Work it around a little bit, and then just kind of, probably don't need to do that, to be honest with you. It seems a tad bit excessive, but gets the rings nice and oily. And then I'll just go ahead and just wipe the head off and then just set it down on this cardboard. The way I look at it, since we cleaned everything the way we did, if we have a little bit of oil in there, I'm not going to be too concerned about it. I'd rather have the rings and the wrist pins nice and lubed up so when they go back in the motor, they can run without any sort of binding issues. Alright guys, so we got the number 2 piston here that's going to go down in this hole. When this little dot in the piston on these factory pistons, that always faces forward towards the front of the motor. We want to take our piston rings, we want to make sure we orient them in opposite directions. So we're going to take the top ring, we're just going to go ahead and put it straight ahead, dead ahead. We're going to take the rear ring, or the number 2 ring, and make sure that's pointing the rear, so that's a perfect 90 degrees out. And then for our oil control ring, for the top ring, we just want to make sure that's at a 45 degree angle to the piston. So we'll go around and find it. The top one is right there. It's pretty close to a 45 degree angle. Bottom one is 90 degrees to that, pretty close to a 45 degree angle. And then just make sure that that center ring doesn't line up anywhere. Okay, so now that we have the piston rings oriented in the direction we want them to, it's time to put these things in the hole. Now, we can't just stick them in the hole like that. Obviously, the rings are holding out. So we have a piston ring compressor, but before we do that, we want to go ahead and get the assembly lube out. And we want to go ahead and get some assembly lube on this. We also want to oil the threads on these rod bolts so that we can get an accurate torque reading. So I'm going to go grab some assembly lube and I'll cut back. So factory rod bolts are torque to yield. I have talked to multiple people, and of course the sloppy guys always agree that these things can be reused. They just say use your best judgment. You can tell if it's getting loose and a little aggressive as you're going to your degree turn. There are 2 different styles of LS based connecting rod bolts. There's a first generation and a second generation. And one way to tell, or a couple ways to tell, is the first gen does not have a shank around the non-threaded part right here. And there's only one dot on top of this little, if you want to call that a bow tie in the middle there, there's only one dot. I have a dot there, you can barely see it. The second gen ones will have 2 dots there. So the way these things torque is 15 degrees on the first pass, and if it is the first design, I have seen between 60 and 75 degrees of rotation. If it's a second design, it is 85 degrees of rotation. Now, if you're doing this in a car, each one of these flats equates to 60 degrees, so you can kind of mark it here and there and do all that. We're not going to go through that right now because we have this out of the car. And then I've also been told too that don't worry about angle of rotation on this, just go to 35 foot-pounds. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to test the 35 foot-pound theory, and we're going to go ahead and get this piston and rod assembly set up. We're going to flip the block over, and we're going to go ahead and torque it down to 15 foot-pounds on the first pass. And then we will do the angle of rotation with our torque wrench, and we'll see how many degrees we get before it clicks. And that'll kind of be a good rule of thumb. We'll test it on a couple of them, but I've heard that 35 foot-pounds is the magic number for these. So we're going to go ahead and make sure we get some oil on these and some assembly lube down here on the bearings, and we're going to get this thing punched in the hole. So let's get to it. I'll put a little sticky red snot on this one. And a little bit on that. Just kind of go ahead and work it over the total bearing surface there. Do the same for the cap. And just put a little assembly lube on there. Those threads are already oiled up, but we'll put the excess assembly lube on there. It ain't going to hurt anything. We'll set the cap to the side. Remember, the dot goes forward. We've got, make sure, double check right now. It's our last chance to make sure our piston rings are oriented in the proper direction. They look pretty damn close. So let's go ahead and get this puppy in here. Set the compressor down onto the deck of the block and just give it a little push. And then you want to make sure too that you can control where the rod is going, because if you have your journal on your crank up and the rod's coming down, you're going to scratch that journal and mess up that bearing surface. So we want to make sure that, especially since we can't see it, that we have the crank all the way down at the bottom of the stroke, and then that way we don't have to worry about messing anything up. Give her a couple soft little love taps with the dead blow. We got her home. So we got one piston down. Let's flip her over and look at what we're going to do on the bottom of the block. So we can see the rod right there. We're going to go ahead and bring the piston and rod down in that hole just a little bit farther, and we're going to bring it up to this journal on the crank so that we can get that cap, that top cap on. So we're going to grab a hold of the rod. We'll go and just bring her on up. Just tapping it with the backside of a wood hammer, dead blow, something along those lines. Get it seated against the crank. Make sure we get our cap on right so that our split cap lines up right. Our tangs are all lined up. Everything is good to go. We'll get her halfway snug down here. Get the torque wrench out and go to town. So we're going to go ahead and set the torque wrench up to 15 foot-pounds. And we're going to go ahead and just bring a little bit of heat on both of these and just kind of torque it down evenly rather than go all of it at once. There's 15. There's 15. So we got our first pass done at 15. And I'm going to go ahead and crank this up to 35. And so we are going to be, on these first gens, we're going to be somewhere between 60 and 75. I get conflating information on the internet, so if we go, and again, I eyeball all this. Being a dirty construction worker, I have a pretty good idea on my angles. So this right here, this will be 90, this will be 45. This right here is going to be about 60 degrees, and just a little bit past is going to be about 70. So we will crank and see where 35 clicks. We're at 45, and I'd say we're pretty close to 45 right there is where that clicked. Okay, so we're a little past. So 90, we're gonna be somewhere about in here. I would say 35 foot-pounds is about 45 degrees on that. So let's go ahead and just bring that up to 40. So now that I've found that it seems like it's going to be about 40, I'm going to go ahead and pull these things loose and retorque them back down to, we're going to try it again. We're going to set it up, pop these guys loose. It still seems like everything's grabbing good, everything's working right, everything's nice and tight. So let's go ahead and drop this down to 15 foot-pounds. Crank her down. Let's go the right direction there. There's 15, 15, 15. All right, let's go back to 40. All right, there's 40. So now 90s here, we're going to want to come to about right here. $40 foot-pounds took us pretty damn close to that. I think 40 is a magic number for at least this one. And we'll go ahead and get the rest of these pistons in the hole. We'll torque all the caps down to 15, and then we'll go back and torque them all to 40 foot-pounds. Keeping an eyeball on the degrees and making sure it's close. If it doesn't come close, if it's way long or it's way short, then we know maybe the bolts are bad, or that maybe there's something in the hole and it's not perfectly aligned. So let's get all the pistons in the hole and see what happens. All right, so we got all the pistons and rods back in the motor. After getting them cleaned up, we got all the piston rings oriented in the right orientation and got them gapped. They actually didn't need to be gapped at all. I didn't have to grind anything. They're actually bigger than I wanted them to be. Surprisingly, cranking down the rod bolts, I went ahead and went to 40 foot-pounds. And I was kind of watching the degrees after I set them all to 15 foot-pounds. I'm kind of watching degrees. It fell in between, somewhere between 45 and 70. So I'm going to call that a pretty good location to have those things drop into. Some of the other ones could have been there a little bit of crud in the bolts and the threads and things like that, which isn't the best, but whatever. It's all bolted back together. I think everything's going to be fine. The plan is to use the old oil pump off the LS1 timing chain. LS9 head gaskets, I have new gaskets. Going to use the LS1 heads that are all set up and ready to go. This motor is not my forever motor. It's just to get me through the summer until the other motor that's being built at the machine shop gets done, which probably won't be till the end of July probably. So got to have a car up and running I can haul the family around. This is the only car I have that can haul 5 people. So it's a must to get that thing back up and running. So I think that's where I'm going to call it a wrap on this one until I get my cam in and some other parts. So thanks for watching, guys, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And while you're at it, go ahead and hit up our Amazon links in the description. It really helps support the channel. It helps us get better audio equipment, microphones, cameras, things like that. Hardly any of the money goes into parts. It almost all goes back into just putting on a better show for you guys. And hey, go check out FTPSpeedShop.com. We'll catch you on the next one, guys. Thanks for watching.